Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. You're getting real food, real science, real nutrition. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. And guess what? P.A.S. Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I got another great episode lined up. It's no secret that American power and influence has been on the decline. And we see this evidence every day. I mean, from the international to the domestic front, the litany of crises, it continues to plague our society. It's only getting worse, and it's because you have a feckless administration. You have an administration that doesn't have a clue on how to govern. There is a leadership void here in the United States, and that void is one of the greatest contributing factors to the decline of American power and influence abroad. And another major contributor within our society is the dropping of standards. This is a big problem. We keep putting in power these failed politicians who've done nothing over a half century thinking that they know how to govern. Too many are ignoring the obvious, and you have all those supposed deep thinkers and policy wonks in our country who still believe nothing has changed in the great power structure since the days of the Soviet collapse in the 80s and the early 90s, when we became the sole superpower of the world. But Look at American power and influence today. Last week was a thorough embarrassment, not only for this administration, but the United States as a whole. And while we remain the sole superpower of the world, it's not going to stay that way for very long if we continue this trend. Nearly everything we are doing is weakening America, both at home and abroad. The policies being implemented are a disaster. Not only are they a disaster, but the policies are doing more harm to our nation. And just look at every issue that I've been harping on over the last several weeks. The economy, inflation, gas prices, energy policy, open borders, the collapse of the educational system, foreign policy. Whatever issue you could think of, are we in a better position today? Are we stronger or weaker as a country? It is stunning how quickly everything seems to be declining. And the worst part is that it doesn't have to be this way. The policies being pushed today aren't based on any reason or logic. They aren't based on what's in America's best interest. They're based on a fringe ideology where it doesn't matter if the policies make sense. What matters is that those pushing these policies believe they are moral, holy warriors. They are virtuous, and they pat themselves on the back to praise themselves for their self-righteousness. Remember,
if people want to really blow up one figure here or one word there, I would argue that they're missing the forest for the trees. I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
It's logic like this that you don't have to realize why we're in this position in the first place. It's logic like this that has done immense damage to our country. As I said, they think they are the moral, holy warriors of the 21st century. They believe they know what is in your best interest than you do for yourself and your family. Listen, it's not about Democrats or Republicans. If the house of cards comes crumbling down, do you think it will matter what political party you're registered with? Do you think that matters? It's about a strong United States, a United States where we grow, prosper, thrive, where American power and influence are respected and feared. As far as policies being based on morality and ethics, understand that it's not always feasible. It's not possible. Sometimes it could come back and have the opposite effect of what you intended. It doesn't mean you don't take morality and ethics into consideration, But you have to be careful when you're developing policy. The real world does not operate on theory. Too many academics, they think theory drives everything, but that's not how the real world operates. Now, I'm going to get into it all. Before I do, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. If you find the show informative, share it with others, and leave the P.A.S. Report podcast a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Now, a few things happened last week that are pretty significant, and they go to the heart of what I mean when I talk about American power and influence. President Biden was giving a closed-door speech at a Democrat fundraiser where he said, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis," end quote. Now, some are jumping all over that statement, and there's plenty of reasons why. First off, it's not that the president was necessarily wrong. I mean, he is correct in what he said, but a president isn't supposed to say that out loud. They're supposed to reassure us that things are under control, that they got it managed. A president needs to choose their words wisely. Whether he's speaking to the public or behind closed doors, it doesn't matter. What a president says matters. Even for a president like Biden. The more a president talks like this, the closer it gets to reality, and you always have to be careful about the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Remember when President Trump came into office? It's amazing. He was listed as a top 10 global threat. The talking heads in the media industrial complex, they endlessly talked about Trump getting us into a nuclear war. They constantly undermined the administration in the international arena. They criticized the former president for excoriating Germany for relying on Russian natural gas. They criticized him when he called out NATO member states for not paying their fair share in NATO. They said he was alienating our allies, even though after 30 years, they finally started to pay more into the alliance. They criticized him for taking out Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Iranian Quds Force, who's directly responsible for the deaths and life-altering injuries to thousands of our U.S. service members. They lied about Bountygate, and everything under the last administration was a 5-alarm fire to the media industrial complex. The world was going to come to an end. President Trump was going to blow the entire world up. But guess what happened? What happened? The world was certainly more stable under Trump's administration than it is under Biden's administration. It's not to say that everything was perfect, but we weren't thinking about Armageddon. President wasn't talking about Armageddon. There were a lot fewer conflicts. The world may not have liked President Trump, but they certainly feared him, and they couldn't predict him. He was unpredictable. And so they were very careful in their policies. They were very careful where they pushed and poked, because they didn't know what the response was going to be. And that brought stability to the world. American power and influence was felt throughout the world. And look at what we got now. Look at what we have now. We're on the brink of Armageddon. American power and influence, nowhere to be felt or seen. We have a complete lack of leadership on the world stage, and it brings me to the more important point. When President Biden talks about Armageddon, why are we on the brink of Armageddon? I mean, maybe he should look in the mirror. And maybe his administration should review the last 2 years to see the policy failures. The fact is that Russia's war in Ukraine was entirely predictable and preventable. This could have been avoided if President Biden had used American power and influence. Instead, the president chose to listen to the neocons and the failed foreign policy establishment of the last 25 years, and he continues to do so. Some of them, they probably wanted this conflict. Then you have those who thoroughly despise Putin, and I understand why. Putin is a monster, but that's not why they despise him. They don't despise him because he's a monster. There's a lot of monsters around the world. They despise him because of Trump. They truly believe that Russia got Trump elected, and for that, they want to destroy Putin and oust him from power. Remember, these are the folks that called the 2016 elections the digital version of Pearl Harbor. They called the 2016 elections an act of war, and now, finally, they may get their war that they wanted. Last week, I was giving a talk in front of a group. Of course, it's academic, so you can imagine where this is going. And I explained that the Russian war in Ukraine was having a destabilizing effect on the world, that the longer the crisis goes on, the more likely the conflict can spread beyond its borders. I explained that the 2 deadliest wars began in Europe, and we could be witnessing the beginnings of the next great war. And it's going to be far deadlier than both World War I and World War II combined. There's no doubt about that. Technology has changed, bombs are bigger, destruction's more massive, fought in civilian areas. I explained how we should show leadership using American power and influence and might to force Russia and Ukraine, Zelensky and Putin, to the diplomatic table to force a diplomatic solution. And then one person rebuffed me. So how can you even think of negotiating a peace agreement with Putin? He's a monster. And I responded that the alternative is actually far worse. And these people always amaze me. The world is full of authoritarian monsters. Every administration has had to make deals with the devil. FDR made a deal with Stalin. Even though Churchill was warning him about the rise of the Soviets and a new Cold War. JFK negotiated with Khrushchev. Nixon negotiated with Mao. There are plenty of other examples. The fact is that leaders lead. And if we're going to play this sanctimonious, holier-than-thou diplomacy crap, well, what about communist China? What about Xi Jinping and the communist regime currently engaged in a friggin' genocide against the Uyghurs and to a lesser degree the Christians? So are we going to take out those monsters? What about Kim Jong-un and his labor and death camps? Are we going to take out that monster? Are we going to take out the brutal regimes like the Iranian mullahs or the Saudi royal family? Are we going to target those monsters? Where does it end? I mean, the fact is monsters exist all over the place, and unfortunately we have to deal with them. But we don't ask questions anymore. We don't think things through. Instead, we go with emotion and the narrative because we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel like we're on the right position, that we're morally right. Anyone who speaks out, they're going to be shamed and ostracized as Putin sympathizers. And these brave, moral, holy warriors push their self-righteousness, even though it won't be them that suffers. It won't be them on the front lines. It won't be them that has to sacrifice. And sadly, they will never be held accountable for their actions because
I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
Well, some seem to have no problem with this war escalating. The fact is, if this conflict expands, it will be like nothing we have ever seen. Every luxury you enjoy today will be gone tomorrow. And sorry, but I won't remain quiet as we watch this administration slowly walk us into a disaster. One thing you don't want to do is destabilize Russia, a country that has over 6,000 nuclear warheads. But that doesn't matter, because we have to go along with these dumb policies and pretend they're in our interest even though they're not. And what the hell is up with Zelensky? I said last week how I was getting a little sick and tired of his constant demands. Notice how he never asks. He just demands. He demands more money. He demands more arms. He demands better intel. Now he's demanding it for a preemptive strike on Russia. He is just as dangerous as Putin at this point. First off, he needs to show some appreciation for all the money and arms we already sent. He should be grateful for the training we've provided. He should be thanking us for the intelligence we shared with him. The fact is that if it wasn't for us, Ukraine would have been finished a long time ago. We are the ones who have given the Ukraine the means to put up a fight, push back against a much stronger country. It's because of us that Ukraine has actually had some success. This isn't to take anything away from Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield. But understand, if it wasn't for us, Ukraine would not be in this position. And now he wants to demand that we conduct a preemptive strike on Russia?
Come on, man.
That's insane, but even more, it's dangerous, and this rhetoric can go wrong in so many ways, yet the Zelensky cheerleaders are out in full force, ready to label anyone who dares criticize this man as a Russian sympathizer. Never once do they think to themselves, what happens if Russia does believe that a U.S. military strike is imminent? What happens then? They're already struggling to take on Ukrainian forces. How can they possibly take on the United States military and NATO members at the same time? They can't. And if they believe it's only a matter of time before we actually strike Russia, what happens if they decide to do a preemptive strike of their own? I could assure you that while some in Putin's orbit may be warning against this, there are others that are encouraging Putin to strike first. So think about where this could go. Rather than use American power and influence to end this conflict, too many are encouraging the theater of war to expand, while Russia is solely to blame for its dumb decisions that are destabilizing the international arena. It doesn't mean we have to go along with it and compound the conflict. I'm sorry, I get to criticize it all I want. That's the beauty of the United States. We're a free country, at least for now, and I really don't get it. If we can end this conflict, we win. We win. American power and influence increases. Think about it this way. If the conflict ends today, we have enormous leverage over Ukraine to influence their policies given all the aid and military support we provided. Even if Russia is able to walk away with an agreement that Ukraine can't join NATO, its military was humiliated on the battlefield. They lost, and they are significantly weaker today than they were prior to the invasion. We'd also see stability be restored to the international system, at least some stability. It's a win all around. And I could assure you that if this conflict ends today, you don't have to worry about China overtaking Taiwan tomorrow. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But instead, you have the loons calling for Ukraine's NATO application to be fast-tracked and for them to be accepted into NATO. Again, how insane are these fools? If you want to talk about strategic interests, I never heard of anything dumber than accepting a nation currently at war into NATO, thereby immediately triggering Article 5 of the NATO Charter, stating that an attack on one is an attack on all, and starting World War III. I mean, that's what Ukraine membership at this point would mean. Not for nothing, but NATO membership increases our risk. It doesn't help us if more countries join NATO. Of course countries are going to want to join NATO. They get the blanket protection of the United States military. Why wouldn't they want to join? So it increases our risk. It benefits those that are joining. Any politician that is taking this proposal seriously needs to be thrown out of office because it is not in our strategic interest, nor is it in the interest of Europe or Ukraine. However, there is a reason that some officials are pushing for this. It's not by accident. It's not that they're just stupid. For the United States to get directly involved in Russia's war in Ukraine, it would have to be approved by Congress, either through a declaration of war or an authorization to use force. As crazy as this Congress has been, as crazy as this Congress is, I believe that if a vote were held today, the majority in Congress would vote no to any declaration of war or authorization to use force. However, if Ukraine gets accepted into NATO, then Congress is irrelevant as per the terms of the NATO Charter. It wouldn't necessarily require congressional approval. It's how the Obama administration justified the Libya operation to oust Muammar Gaddafi. Obama never had authorization to attack Libya, but if they use the NATO Charter and say that it's through NATO, that's different. And of course, many of those who have been responsible for pushing the worst foreign policy decisions over the last 25, 30 years, of course, they're the ones that are pushing this idea of letting Ukraine into NATO while Ukraine's at war. You want to do arms transfers, intelligence sharing, providing money and training, that's one thing. We may disagree on it, but that's one thing. I could live with that. But pushing a hot war, that's a little bit of a bridge too far. We've all been there before. You want to get someone the perfect gift for the perfect occasion, but you have no idea what to get. Well, you don't have to rack your brain anymore. Gift baskets are perfect for any occasion, whether it's birthdays, holidays, corporate events, or a simple thank you. At designeryourselfgiftbaskets.com, you get to choose the theme and the products that go into the basket. You have a coffee lover? Try the K-Cup basket. You're looking for something special for the person that loves to barbecue? No problem. There's a basket for it. Make every basket unique to the person you're sending it to. And if you're in a rush and don't have time to customize the gift basket, it's not an issue because at DIYGB.com you can choose from hundreds of pre-arranged baskets based on the occasion, theme, or recipient. And P.A.S. report listeners get 10% off using code P.A.S. at checkout. So go to DIYGB.com, find the perfect gift for the perfect occasion, and use coupon code P.A.S. at checkout to get 10% off your order. Visit DIYGB.com today. And if we get sucked into this conflict, how long do you think it would take for China to invade Taiwan? The only reason Communist China hasn't attempted to recapture Taiwan and make the one China policy a reality is that they still worry about American involvement. However, if the United States is fighting a war with Russia, the communist regime is going to have little to fear from us. They're going to quickly mobilize, recapture the tiny island. And if China does decide to give it a go, it won't be anything like Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. China is not going to get bogged down. They've been watching the Ukrainian conflict very carefully. They conduct lessons learned, determining what Russia did wrong, why they failed. Not only have they studied Russia's war in Ukraine, they studied our failures, right? They looked at the pressure and strain we put on our military fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. So imagine this scenario. Russia and China are no Afghanistan and Iraq. We were stretched in then. Imagine what a major war with that would look like. It would be impossible to take both these countries on at the same time. They're not stupid. They know that. And they know the quicker they could take over the island of Taiwan, the less likely we would confront them militarily. It would be too late. They already took it over. What can you do? Also, don't forget, China doesn't have good relations with other countries in the Pacific. If China decides to move on Taiwan, what would the reaction be from Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, even Australia? Remember, there are a lot of disputes with China over the many islands in the South and East China Seas, where a lot of these countries lay claim to the islands, as does China. If China takes over Taiwan, likelihood is China's going to move on these islands as well, begin to militarize them. So will other countries declare war? Would some of these countries view it as an act of aggression, the opening salvo of Chinese imperialism? Would China's neighbors see an existential threat and declare war on China? Again, you have to look at the history between these countries. Would Australia decide to declare war, given that they would be directly impacted by a Chinese takeover of the Pacific? In May of 2021, don't forget, an Australian military general warned that there was a high likelihood of a conflict with China in the coming years. Australia purchased billions of dollars of American air defense systems over the last few years. Why do you think they want air defense systems, and who do you think it's designed to repel? Any conflict with Russia has the likely potential to result in waning American power and influence in the Pacific region and a much more hostile Pacific region. China isn't the only country also that may move militarily against another nation. Look at the Kim Jong regime. The Kim Jong regime is at it again, launching a barrage of missiles, including a couple over Japan. The missiles over Japan, obviously a very provocative move. However, it's not like we've never seen this movie before. We've been down this road before. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, the Kim Jong regime routinely engages in these types of tests to seek attention. That's why they normally do it. They want to seek attention. They want to win some concessions for the United States. Things changed slightly under the Trump administration when President Trump called out Kim Jong-un, and then they engaged in a barrage of insults, Little Rocket Man, Dough Turd. It was actually pretty funny, to be honest with you. President Trump coordinated crushing sanctions that even China signed on to. That was amazing. Ultimately, President Trump would meet with Kim Jong-un and the missile tests ended, right? The threat was alleviated. Now, I think the whole idea of North Korea denuclearization was always an unrealistic policy. It's still unrealistic to this day. It's pretty much the only thing that keeps the North Korean regime in power. And make no mistake about it, the regime saw what happened to Gaddafi. After Gaddafi did away with Libya's nuclear program in 2003, 2004, even though we gave him assurances that that the idea of regime change is off the table, we gave him those assurances under the Bush administration. The Obama administration reversed course in 2011, and Gaddafi met a very violent end once he gave up his nuclear program. Do you think that's not lost on Kim Jong-un? So the real question when we look at these missile tests, the question is whether these missile tests and perhaps an upcoming nuclear test are part of the same old strategy of North Korea to get attention and possibly win some concessions, or if something different is going on. Is North Korea becoming emboldened as American power and influence declines? Are the North Koreans calculating that if the United States is engaged in a major conflict in Europe, that's when they should move to see South Korea in an attempt to unify the Korean Peninsula under his dictatorial regime? Now, I don't have the answer to that, but it is certainly a possibility that we cannot dismiss. While most in America don't pay attention to South Korean politics, earlier this year, South Korea elected a new president who is taking a much tougher stance against North Korea than his predecessor did. The new president identified the Kim Jong regime as the country's main enemy. And at a time when we are witnessing growing instability on the world stage, this is certainly a situation that we need to monitor because something bigger could be going on here. But the clearest example of a decline in American power and influence took place last week when OPEC announced that it was cutting production by 2 million barrels of oil per day. And I'm not going to lie, this one surprised me, and it made me look bad in front of my classes. All right before OPEC's decision, I said, they're probably going to maintain productivity levels. I doubt they're going to increase it, but I don't see them cutting production. That's what I told my classes. Wow, was I wrong? I mean, the reason I told my classes that is because I've been following the administration's attempts to lobby Saudi Arabia to increase its oil production. So you would think, at the very least, maintaining productivity levels, given the increasing costs of energy and the inflation crisis, you would think that that's where Saudi Arabia and OPEC would decide. Saudi Arabia is the main influence within OPEC, and they are the ones that have the say when it comes to productivity levels. Because the Biden administration was lobbying the Saudis so hard, this was nothing less than a major embarrassment on the world stage for the United States and a slap in the face to the Biden administration. This cut in production levels was intentional. It was designed to hurt the United States. In response to OPEC's announcement, the Biden administration announced that it's going to be releasing an additional 10 million barrels of oil from our strategic petroleum reserve to try and maintain current pricing. Now, I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. Saudi Arabia announces that they're going to cut by 2 million barrels of oil per day. Releasing 10 million barrels is 5 days' worth. This is idiotic on so many levels, and the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was never meant to be used for gas prices, to manipulate them, and because there's an election coming up. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was meant to be used in case of an energy crisis, an oil embargo on us. When oil prices crashed in 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdowns, the Trump administration actually sought to replenish the stockpiles. They wanted to buy 77 million barrels of oil, bringing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to full capacity. At the time, they would be purchasing the oil at a very cheap price, so it would have been a smart decision. Unfortunately, Senator Schumer and the Democrats torpedoed the bill, calling it a $3 billion bailout for big oil. And only Congress is authorized to make these types of purchases. So when Trump left office, the oil reserves had 638 million barrels of oil in them. Today, under the Biden administration, the number's far worse. In an attempt to manipulate oil prices, our strategic petroleum reserves have sunk to levels not seen in decades. As of September, the number of barrels of oil was 422 million, and it was continuing to drop. It's at its lowest level since 1984, and soon we're going to be even lower than that. And what many aren't taking into consideration is the growth of our nation since 1984. So it's even worse than it actually sounds. There's far more things to power today than in 1984. There's far larger population today than there was in 1984. Tapping the reserves is nothing more than a joke and will have no real benefits to us except jeopardizing our national security. And that's the sad part. Again, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. We got plenty of oil and natural gas here. We don't need the Saudis. We don't need OPEC. But instead of tapping our reserves, the Biden administration is now begging the Maduro regime in Venezuela to produce more oil. How embarrassing is that? The fact that we're even considering this is insane, because why are we going to make ourselves beholden to the Venezuelans? Why do we have to be beholden to the Saudis? Why do we have to be beholden to every other nation when we have all the resources we need right here in the United States? We have plenty of oil here in the United States. We have enough oil to flood the markets and crash the prices. But they won't do that because it goes against their radical green energy agenda. You have all these so-called climate warriors who don't want the United States to produce its own oil, but they don't have any problem relying on brutal regimes and asking those regimes to increase their output. And they're such phonies when you actually think about it, because we can produce the oil here in the United States in a much cleaner and more efficient way and with a much smaller footprint on the environment. However, instead, they would rather make us beholden to brutal dictatorships who certainly don't have our best interests in mind, who have little regard for the environment. But as long as the eco-warriors can pat themselves on the back, they don't care. And it shows you what frauds they are, and that it's all about optics rather than a sensible climate policy. This represents one of the best examples of the decline of American power and influence. We have the power. Why not use it? But don't worry. Ignore the incompetence. Ignore the fires raging throughout the world. Ignore how we're being weakened here at home. Ignore how our families are struggling economically, having to decide what bills to pay and which ones we don't pay. And ignore all that, because the moral holy warriors are just. And it's not what's in the best interest of the United States that matters. It's their self-righteousness, where they get to pat themselves on the back and think that they are better and more virtuous than everyone else. Remember,
I think that there's a lot of people more concerned about being precisely, factually, and semantically correct than about being morally right.
It really is sad, because it doesn't have to be this way at all. All these policy decisions can easily be reversed. We could have a strong United States, one where American power and influence are increasing, not decreasing. One where we advance our policy agenda that not only benefits us, but benefits the free world. And we have to stop playing checkers here in the United States, start playing chess. All these politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, that continually push policies that hurt us need to go. And that's the beauty of the United States. In just 4 weeks, we are the ones that get to determine the future of this country. And we can at least slow things down. And maybe, just maybe, if Republicans win the House and the Senate, maybe President Biden and his administration will pull a 1994 Bill Clinton and moderate on their positions. Maybe if we elect a Republican governor here in New York, maybe we can stop the bleeding. We could begin to put New York back together, and we could turn New York City and New York State into a vibrant place like it once was. We are the ones that are in control of our destiny, not the politicians. So let's exert our influence over the system. Now, I hope you found the content of this episode informative. If you did, don't forget to give the PAS Report rating a 5-star rating with Apple Podcasts. Take 30 seconds to write a review. Make sure to share this episode with others. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the PAS Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.